when I started college, I was 19 years old, and I had just come back from a year in Israel, where I was studying in yeshiva, and it was a very difficult transition. When I came back, there was a lot less spirituality, or at least there seemed to be. This is back in Toronto, where I'm from. I went to college. And I found myself within a couple of months being a little bit anxious, feeling a little bit worried about what's my future going to be like, what are my friendships going to be like. And I just had a lot weighing on my mind. So I went to my rabbi. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I wanted to get some advice, and I went to my Rav. And I told him, I'm feeling a little anxious. I'm not sure. Should I see a psychologist? Should I see a psychiatrist? Should I go on medication? Rebbe, what should I do? And he promptly got up of the room that we were sitting in, and he ran out. And I said to myself, oh dear, what did I just do? So at that point, we were studying in this school, and he was running down the corridor of the hallway. So I ran after him, and I see he darts left. So I dart left after him, and then he darts right into the photocopy room. So I run after him into the photocopy room, and I find him at the photocopier voraciously copying page after page after page of this book. And I think to myself, this is very strange. I told my mentor I have, some trouble with anxiety, and now he's sitting here doing something that looks compulsive. Is he trying to tell me he has an anxiety disorder himself? What's going on here? After about a good 5 minutes of copying, he hands me a document, and he says, David, I don't know whether you should see a psychologist or a psychiatrist or do medication, or I don't know what you should do, but I have an idea. I'd like you to read this book, this text, for 20 minutes every day and seriously think about the contents of this book. Don't just read it, really try to internalize it for 20 minutes a day for the next 30 days. And maybe it'll help you, and maybe it won't. If it doesn't help, then we're going to go back and try to get you to someone who can assist you. But I'd like to give you a try. Would you do an experiment? So I said, I can deal with this anxiety for another 30 days. It wasn't dangerous. I wasn't harming myself or anybody else. And I could kind of hack it. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And I looked at this text, and it said, the duties of the heart, the section of trust in God. It was the Chovos HaLevavos, the section called Shar HaBitachon. I later found out that text has been used for thousands of years to help inculcate the value of belief and trust in God in order to help people who are coping with anxiety, a lack of hope, a lack of meaning, a lack of purpose, people who are struggling emotionally in some regards. For over 1,000 years, that text has been used since it was published in the 11th century in Spain. So I had this experience where within 2 weeks of really focusing on this text, I was feeling a lot better. I found myself not worrying as much. My muscle tension was down. I found myself breathing more easily. I was sleeping better. And I really attributed it to this experience that I had of reading this book. And what was interesting to me is that none of the factors that were making me anxious in the first place had changed. I still didn't know what I was going to major in. Socially, it was a little bit of a challenging time for me. I was still living in Toronto, and my heart was still in Israel, back in yeshiva, and none of those factors had changed, but my emotions had changed. And what it did is it shifted my perspective, and I came to the belief and the realization that I don't know how, and I don't know where it's going to come from, but ultimately it's going to be okay. I'm in good hands. So a couple years later, I found myself at the University of Toronto with the opportunity to study counseling psychology. And I came to my academic mentors, and I told them about this story. And they said, well, why don't you do a study on it? I'm like, I can do a research study on this? I said, sure, why not? And I learned about psychometric testing and how to create a measure, a psychometric measure of trust in God, of bitachon. And I started to evaluate, how could this be understood from a psychological lens? Can this be really a bona fide psychological theory that could help people aside from me? Was it only my experience, or could it be the other experience of other people also that if they have greater levels of trust, that they have lower levels of worry and anxiety. And it was a tough path because the academic world is, now it's fairly open to spiritual and religious issues, but at the time it really was not. And it was a tough path, and I ended up graduating and doing my master's thesis on the subject, but it was hard to sort of break into the academic world. But in my doctoral work, I was, thank God, able to. And I worked with a mentor in the United States. His name is Kenneth Pargament. He's a well-known researcher on spiritual and religious issues in mental health. And he helped me to turn this into a body of research. And over time, we evaluated that individuals who have greater levels of trust and belief in God actually had less anxiety and less depression, and were doing a little bit better in terms of well-being. And a couple years later, I actually created a treatment study, a treatment program to help people build levels of trust in God, or bitachon as it's called in Hebrew. And the question was, is that going to help people who worry and who have anxiety in order to overcome their levels of stress? We compared that in a randomized controlled trial, people's trust in God training, to something called progressive muscle relaxation, where people tense up their muscles and then they release them. And that's also a way of being able to control one's anxiety. And we had a third group of people who received no treatment at all. And what we found was that the trust in God condition, the people who completed that, they did substantially better, and the effects were actually very significant. In statistical terms, it was a 2 standard deviation decrease in anxiety and worry over only a 2-week period, which is very, very significant. You typically don't find large effect sizes like that from treatments of this nature. And from there, it's been just one wild ride since. I mean, at this point, I've been doing that kind of research with a broad population at the hospital where I work in Boston. And I've been doing research within the medical school for about 10 years now on spiritual and religious issues and how they relate. And there have been some of this. And these are things that unfortunately are ubiquitous today. Almost everybody is grappling with some level of emotional distress. And having a sense of faith, it seems scientifically to really be able to serve as a resource for people to help them get through those difficult times if we draw on that. And if we teach people to draw on it in a methodical way. Another finding is that faith really can serve as an important resource. This study came out of my own personal experience when I was an undergraduate student, when I was in college. Maybe that was just my experience. I didn't know whether that generalized to hundreds of other people, and it turns out that it did. It really provided clear evidence that working on one's faith can reduce levels of anxiety and depression and make things better. Experimental, clinical evidence with individuals who had substantial levels of worry and anxiety in the first place. So in the program, the Increase Your Trust in God program, this is one of the exercises that we did. We encouraged individuals to think about a stressful time in the past where things were not going well, where they felt very anxious about the outcome, they were worried about what might happen, and to think very deeply about what they were worried about at the time. It might have been that they were waiting for the results of a medical test, or they weren't sure whether a business deal is going to work out, or they were waiting to hear if a loved one is okay or not when they weren't sure. Something significant. And ideally, it should be a situation that worked out better in the end than they thought. And then the next step is to think about what they were worried about. After the think about what they were worried about, the next step is to think about God's knowledge at the time. How God knew, so to speak, that things would work out in the end, at least better than they initially anticipated. And then to think about God's involvement in the situation. What did God do in order to bring about that outcome, in order to make sure that everything was aligned. And then finally, to thank God for the positive result, or at least the less than terribly negative result that occurred, and to appreciate the fact that there was this salvation. What's important about this exercise is that people often attend to negative things that are going on. Oh no, what about this? Oh no, what about that? But there's a tendency to turn away and to not stop and contemplate positive things that have happened in the past. And it really is a skill to sit and to think about it. Some of the davening, some of the tefillos, some of the prayers that Orthodox Jews say on a regular basis get to that. Start to think about things in the past where they've had a difficult time. And I think there's even a prayer which is said, or a blessing which is said on a place where somebody went through a miracle, where somebody went through a difficult situation and was spared, and there's actually a blessing which is stated. So you find these concepts in the corpus of Torah thought, and this exercise helps a person to refocus on positive outcomes as well as what they are worried about.
So two guys were getting to know each other, and as we always do, they asked each other, "What do you do?" So one responds, "I'm a lawyer with a successful firm." "And what do you do?" And the second guy responded, "I'm an optimist." And he says, "Really, that's interesting. You're an optimist, a professional optimist. So why do you always look so worried?" He shakes his head. "You think it's easy being an optimist?" It's not easy being an optimist. Just look at the headlines. Just look at the news. It's so easy to get cynical. It's so hard to be optimistic, to not become jaded. But when we look throughout history, we have role models that teach us how we can keep the optimism no matter what's going on. One of my favorite women throughout history is Miriam, Moses' older sister. And when she was just a little girl, she realized that there was something really, really, really detrimental to the Jewish people going on. She was a smart cookie. She realized that her parents, her father Amram and his wife, were separated because they were so disturbed and so distressed by King Pharaoh's decree that all Jewish babies were going to be killed. They said, "What's the point? So why have kids?" And they separated. And little Miriam pointed her finger at her father and she said, "You know what? You're even worse than King Pharaoh. King Pharaoh went ahead and made a decree against the Jewish boys. But if you're separate from mom, and if this is what you as a leader are dictating to the rest of the Jewish people, you're not allowing even baby girls to be born." And she gave a prophecy and she said, "You'll see there's going to be a redeemer." And actually her parents listened to her wise words and Moses was conceived. But here's the thing. Moses didn't take the Jews out of Egypt 5 years later, 20 years later. It was a lot longer. And Miriam didn't walk around disillusioned, cynical. I don't know if it's still happening. She was so confident that the redemption would happen. You know what she did? She had a tambourine hanging on her wall. And she said, "You'll see, when the Jews are going to go out of this exile and they're going to go out, I'm going to take that tambourine and I'm going to play it." And what do you think happened? When the time came and the Jews went out of Egypt, Miriam and all the women that she influenced had their tambourines and they started this whole ensemble and they were musically dancing. That tambourine was like Miriam's vision board. That was what she pointed at and she knew this is what she was getting at. So when I think of how Judaism impacts my optimism or my view of living, I think of that vision board. I think of how my thoughts can impact the reality. I think of the faith that Miriam had, that I could have. And what tambourine do I have to show that no matter what the headlines are saying, I'm confident that this exile will be finished And there's going to be a redemption and a plan and a positive future for the Jewish people and the entire world.
I think it's very important to distinguish between psychological optimism and theological optimism. Psychological optimism suggests that optimism is literally the best way to live your life. I think it was Shimon Peres who said that both pessimists and optimists die the same death, but they live very different lives. And this is true from a quality of life point of view. Those who are optimistic tend to view their lives more positively at any given time. But theological optimism says something very different. We're not optimistic because it's the best way to live life. We're optimistic because it's the truest way to live life. In other words, there is a certain acceptance to a belief system, a particular way of viewing reality, existence, history, the human condition, that stems from a higher vantage point, from theology, from Judaism. You see, if we stop and think about it for a moment, from a secular point of view, why should I be optimistic? Every individual in this world comes across challenges. That's part of the occupational hazards of life. I don't know of a person in this world that doesn't have a challenge. So where should optimism stem from? And if you talk about the human condition and human evolution and human history and all that, if history is anything to go by, human beings we repeat the same mistakes time and again. So why should I believe in progress just because? So secular optimism is in a certain sense subscribing to a certain mythic idea about the human condition, about human history, and about life itself. If, however, your optimism is rooted in Judaism, it's a very different optimism because it's predicated on a number of principles. Number one, there is a God, which means to say there is an author to this universe. Point two, which is as essential, God is good, meaning God wants your good. And point three, God doesn't just want your good as an individual, but wants the good of mankind in the collective. And this gives birth to the idea that there is a storyline and a plot to human history, which is actually progressing towards a very positive and eventual state called the Messianic era, a time of ultimate goodness for all. And so the more you immerse yourself and the more you delve into the Jewish teachings of optimism, the stronger, the deeper the foundation and roots and platform for true, lasting, authentic optimism. Because through Judaism, we learn, based on the prophets, that the arc of history bends forward. That's the power of theological optimism. Now, psychological optimism is fantastic, very important, because there's a lot of teachings about ourselves that help us. There's gratitude and many other practices that help us create a positive environment, a positive island, as it were, to inhabit. But it's important, in addition to that, to introduce theological optimism, which means to say, go out there and study the Jewish text on optimism. See what Judaism has to say about the human condition. Yes, there is nastiness. Yes, there is ugliness. But beneath that all, there are precious minerals. There is a point of goodness and godliness, of light and love within each and every human being created in divine image. And so once you believe that, you're able to see past the veneer, past the surface, because you know that there is something deeper there. The same with human history. And of course, this great idea, the ultimate end of days, which is the time of Mashiach, which we believe in, and hopefully internalize the idea that guides us towards seeing past the setbacks, and there are many setbacks. But the overall arc, again, as mentioned, is positive and will lead us to that time when, please God, the inner essence of reality will be exposed and divine wisdom will be available to all. What are three things one can do to add positivity and optimism in their life? So it's quite interesting. I recently finished a book called Positivity Bias, and there's an entire chapter called 10 Commandments for Designing a Positive Life, Life of the Positivity. I'll share with you just a few. One comes to us by way of a story of a British business person who came to see the Rebbe at some point, and he was quite depressed and miserable. He had a bit of a pessimistic personality. And at one point, after trying to encourage this man to engage more positively with life, the Rebbe says, I'd like you to look for more positive company. Try to find people in your life that are more positive. And I think this is a very powerful idea. It's being very conscious about how you curate your social circle. there are people who we engage with, and maybe in the moment we enjoy their company, but when we leave that meeting, that encounter, that coffee, we feel low, we feel small. We feel ugly inside. Maybe we engage in gossip, maybe we engage in negativity, whatever it may have been that person brings out in us. When we leave that encounter and we look back on it, it doesn't make us feel like our best self. If you're involved with such people, and these are the interactions you're having, I would encourage you to rethink that friendship, rethink that relationship. I think what the Rebbe was trying to tell this individual is, you are a product of your social circle. You are a product of your environment. If you look for and you discover and you make a point of immersing yourself in a positive and joyful and optimistic culture, that will inevitably rub off on you and make you a more positive and optimistic individual. And so I encourage you to go through your phone list. And you can go person to person and ask yourself, when I leave a meeting with this individual, do I feel uplifted? Do I feel stronger, more empowered? Do I feel good about myself? Am I encouraged in this person's presence to be my best self? If so, that's a perfect relationship. Make more time to see that person more often. If the opposite is true, try to see them less. You will see within a short period of time, your entire day-to-day mindset, mood, all of that will change for the better. A second point. The reality is that today we're bombarded by media, by news, social media, and so forth, and a very large percentage of it is negative. The fact of the matter is that the news presents the things that are most shocking, that are most traumatic, that are most worrisome, and that really raises the stress levels, and it's really unhealthy. And it also skews one's perspective on reality itself. Because, for example, I don't know if you know this, but last year, 40 million planes landed safely. Very few planes didn't. And yet, if I were to ask you about the plane industry, people who didn't know the first fact would say, oh, it's getting worse, it's getting out of hand, the planes are dropping, they're going missing, what's happening? And that's because your focus, your frame, is focused on negative news rather than positive news. So make a point of engaging with positive news, with positive books, positive thinkers. Watch debates, watch lectures by some of the great minds of this generation that are talking about the tremendous advances and progress our world is making. This will give you a more balanced and healthy and contextualized reality. And of course, without a doubt, it will raise your optimism levels and it will ensure that you recognize the truth of the matter, which is that we live in unprecedentedly good times. And the third thing I would say is develop a deep and authentic relationship with God. Because the fact of the matter is that very often our love is measured, our love for ourselves is very conditional. The Western world in which we live on places great value on outer success rather than inner value. And therefore, I think it's essential to at least have a part of your inner world, a part of your life, deeply rooted in and connected to Hashem, to the one presence in your life that doesn't judge you, doesn't evaluate you, doesn't measure you up, but accepts you, embraces you as you are. And if you internalize that idea, it's truly liberating, it's empowering, and if you take it a step further, birth is God's way of saying you matter. Or in the words of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, your birth, the day you were born, is the day God decided that the world could not exist without you. If you can internalize those ideas, you have a place to go to at any given time that can truly fuel a tremendous sense of self-worth and positivity and optimism, because you're here for a reason and you can rededicate yourself to that purpose. And so if your self-love, self-acceptance, which often translates into one's happiness and positivity levels, is dependent on one's personal performance in whatever industry it might be, the keys to your happiness really are not in your own hands, but rather you handed them to outer circumstances that are literally beyond your control. You can put your best foot forward in business and yet something fall through. Not because you didn't do it right, but because of circumstances. And the same is with other aspects of what the modern world calls a successful life. If, however, you can create this inner sanctuary where you can go to at any given time, where there is a presence, the presence and connection to Hashem, who is with you at all times and loves you as you are at all times and believes in you at all times, you can tap into a place of positivity, empowerment, and happiness at any given moment. And that's truly empowering, and there's nothing more uplifting than that.
Well, I was in the middle of the struggle when the situation looked very dangerous, when some of my friends in Helsinki group were already arrested, when new wave of repressions against Jewish activists was clearly prepared. And at this time I received a note from my wife Avital through some American Jewish tourist. That was always our communication through tourists. And together with this note, a small psalm book. And Avital writes that this psalm book was with me in the last year when I was trying to help you in different places in the world. And I have a feeling that the time has come to send it to you. And I opened the book, and I can't read there anything, because I never learned how to read these texts when there is no modern period and comma, and where at the end of the sentence and the beginning. And also, most of the words I don't know. Many of the words I know, about 1,000 words, mainly of our daily struggle, prison. And there is mentioned this small black book, not in Russian. That's what they are describing. And I understand that they are talking about this psalm book, which was sent to by Avital. And then I remember this note which you sent. And I start, and I demand that they'll give it to me. And it was a long struggle. 3 years after I was arrested, they returned this book to me, together with the telegram from my mother that my father passed away. And it's, of course, it's difficult when, it's always difficult, but when you cannot be with your family. And I decided that the only thing which I can do, I will be reading this psalm book until I understand. And so I'm reading these hundreds of thousands of words where I cannot understand where the sentence begins and ends, and can't understand more than half of the words. And then simply comparing between different places of these words, I try to find out the connections between them. And it so happened that the first phrase from all these hundreds of thousands of words was a short phrase of 13 very short words, which I understood fully, that is the phrase, Gam ki elech bagay tzalamavet lo ira ra ki ata imadi. It's from the Psalm Kav Gimel, and when you'll go through the valley of shadow of death, you'll fear no evil because you are with me. And that was very powerful, as if, who is you? It can be my wife, it can be King David, it can be Kadosh Baruch Hu, it can be Am Yisrael, it can be all of them together came to prison to help me. So at the time I understood all the Psalms, more or less, and it was very important for me. And each time when they were taking it from me, I was fighting and on hunger strikes, refusing to work, sometimes refusing to eat until they'll bring it to me back. And even when they already took me from prison and replaced all my clothes, I was lying in the snow refusing to enter the airplane without getting this book back, because I felt that all my strength is there. So that was the only piece of property which I took from prison, and all these years it's always with me, and it gives me a lot of strength.